The distant church bell tolled as the morning sun crested over the mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Chisholm Ranch, New Mexico Territory. Willow O'Sullivan stood beneath the weathered oak tree, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the vast desert stretched endlessly, unaware that this Sunday in 1876 would change everything she believed about faith, love, and her place in this unforgiving frontier. Willow's arrival in Chisholm Ranch had stirred considerable whispers. A 23-year-old schoolteacher from Boston with fiery auburn hair and unwavering opinions wasn't the typical addition to their modest settlement. She'd come west following her father's death, determined to forge her own path away from the suffocating expectations of Eastern society. The small schoolhouse at the edge of town had been without a teacher for nearly 6 months, and despite reservations about hiring a woman with her outspoken reputation, the town council had been desperate enough to offer her the position. 3 months into her tenure, Willow had gained respect for her teaching abilities, but her refusal to conform to certain social expectations kept her at arm's length from most of the community. Her daily walks to the schoolhouse were often accompanied by stares and hushed conversations that ceased the moment she passed by. This particular Sunday morning, Willow had finally acquiesced to Mrs. Abernathy's persistent invitations to attend church services. She'd carefully selected her most modest dress, a deep blue calico with a high collar and long sleeves despite the early summer heat, and pinned her unruly hair into a tight bun. Yet, as she approached the small white clapboard church, her steps slowed. "Miss O'Sullivan, Mrs. Abernathy called, waving enthusiastically from the church steps. "How wonderful to see you've decided to join us today." Willow forced a smile, smoothing her hands over her skirt. "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy. I've saved you a seat right beside me," the older woman said, taking Willow's arm. "Everyone will be so pleased to see you here." Willow doubted that very much, but allowed herself to be guided through the open doors. The interior was simple wooden pews arranged in neat rows, a modest altar at the front, and a small pulpit where Reverend Thompson stood reviewing his notes. The congregation had nearly filled every available seat, and Willow felt dozens of eyes turn to assess her as Mrs. Abernathy led her toward the front. "Mrs. Abernathy," Willow whispered, "perhaps we could sit further back." "Nonsense, dear. The Lord deserves our full attention, and that means sitting where we can hear every blessed word." Trapped by politeness, Willow slid into the third pew, nodding stiffly at the curious glances directed her way. The Hammond family occupied the space to her right, their 5 children arranged by height like stair steps. To her left sat Sheriff Miller and his wife, both of whom acknowledged her with brief nods before returning to their whispered conversation. The church filled quickly as the final bell sounded. Reverend Thompson stepped to the pulpit, his imposing figure commanding immediate silence. Willow had encountered him only briefly since her arrival in Chisholm Ranch, finding him stern and unyielding in his convictions, much like the ministers she'd known back east. "Let us bow our heads in prayer," Reverend Thompson intoned, his deep voice resonating through the small space. All around Willow, heads lowered in immediate compliance. Mrs. Abernathy beside her bent so low her nose nearly touched her clasped hands. The Hammond children, even the fidgety youngest boy, ducked their heads in practiced unison. But Willow remained upright, her chin level, eyes open. She hadn't planned this small rebellion. In Boston, she'd attended church with her father, going through the motions of faith without question. But since his passing and her journey west, something had changed. The God she'd been raised to fear and obey seemed increasingly distant, and the rituals increasingly hollow. Her father's painful death from consumption had left her questioning what kind of benevolent deity would allow such suffering. A tense silence descended as Reverend Thompson's prayer continued. Willow could feel Mrs. Abernathy's body stiffen beside her as the older woman became aware of Willow's upright posture. Several rows back, someone cleared their throat pointedly. "And Lord, we ask that you guide the hearts of the wayward and rebellious among us," Reverend Thompson added, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "that they might learn humility and proper reverence in your house." Willow's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross hanging behind the pulpit. The prayer seemed to stretch endlessly, each word feeling like a direct admonishment. When the Reverend finally said, "Amen," the congregation's unified response was followed by a wave of shifting and rustling as people settled into their seats, many turning to glance disapprovingly in Willow's direction. Mrs. Abernathy leaned close. "Dear, when we pray, we bow our heads out of respect," she whispered, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "I meant no disrespect," Willow replied quietly. "I simply choose to face God directly, Mrs." Abernathy's eyes widened in shock, and Willow knew her words would be repeated throughout town before sundown. Reverend Thompson's sermon that morning focused on the virtues of obedience and submission, with frequent references to the proper role of women in society and church. Willow endured each pointed statement with outward calm, though her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When the service finally ended, she stood quickly, intent on making a hasty exit. "Miss O'Sullivan," Reverend Thompson's voice halted her retreat. "A moment, if you please." The congregation filtered around them, many lingering within earshot as Willow reluctantly approached the pulpit. "I couldn't help but notice your unconventional approach to prayer this morning," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "I apologize if it caused disruption, Reverend," Willow replied, her tone measured despite her racing heart. "But I don't believe God requires us to assume any particular posture to hear our prayers." The Reverend's expression hardened. "The Bible instructs us in proper worship, Miss O'Sullivan. Pride has no place in God's house. With all due respect, I don't consider it pride to stand before my Creator as He made me." A few gasps sounded from those still within hearing distance. Reverend Thompson's face flushed dark beneath his collar. "As the teacher of this town's children, you have a responsibility to model appropriate behavior," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I would strongly suggest you reconsider your attitude before next Sunday's service." Before Willow could respond, a deep voice interrupted from behind her. "I believe the service has concluded, Reverend. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued in private." Willow turned to find herself looking up at Vaughn Galloway, owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory. She'd seen him from a distance since her arrival, but had never spoken directly with the man who employed half the town. He cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a closely trimmed beard that did little to soften his weathered features. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, held the Reverend's gaze steadily. "Mr. Galloway," Reverend Thompson's tone shifted to something more conciliatory, "I was merely offering some spiritual guidance to our new schoolteacher." "So I gathered," Vaughn replied, the barest hint of a drawl in his voice. "But it seems to me that spiritual guidance is best received when offered in the spirit of kindness rather than public correction." The Reverend's mouth tightened. "I merely seek to ensure that all who enter God's house show proper respect." And I suspect God is less concerned with the angle of Miss O'Sullivan's head than with the intentions of her heart, Vaughn said, his tone pleasant but unyielding. A tense silence stretched between them. Willow stood frozen, acutely aware of the whispers and stares from the remaining congregants. Finally, Reverend Thompson offered a tight smile. "We all want what's best for our community, Mr. Galloway. I trust you'll be joining us for the social after the evening service." "Unfortunately, I have business at the ranch," Vaughn replied. "Good day, Reverend." He tipped his hat slightly and turned to Willow. "Miss O'Sullivan, I believe you're headed in the same direction as me. May I accompany you?" Grateful for the escape he offered, Willow nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Galloway." They walked in silence until they were well away from the church, the morning sun now beating down with intensity that matched Willow's embarrassment. She stared straight ahead, painfully aware of the stairs following them down the main street. "I appreciate your intervention, Mr. Galloway," she finally said, "though I fear you've now associated yourself with the town scandal." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Chisholm Ranch has survived far worse scandals than a schoolteacher who prays standing up." "You must think me terribly stubborn." "What I think," he said carefully, "is that God hears you standing tall just as well as he hears the rest of us with our noses to the ground." Willow stopped walking, surprised by his words. "That's not the reaction I expected from the town's leading citizen." "I've spent most of my life on horseback, Miss O'Sullivan. I've had many conversations with God under open skies, and very few of them involved bowed heads." His expression grew more serious. "Though I should warn you, Reverend Thompson isn't known for his flexibility, and this town follows his lead in matters of faith." "I've noticed," Willow said dryly. "I suspect tomorrow's school attendance may reflect that influence." Vaughn nodded. "It might. But for what it's worth, you've earned respect for your teaching. The Peterson boys are reading now, which their father thought impossible. They just needed patience and the right approach." "Much like faith, I imagine," Vaughn replied. They had reached the small boarding house where Willow rented a room. "I won't keep you any longer, Miss O'Sullivan, but I wanted to say that not everyone in Chisholm Ranch shares Reverend Thompson's rigid views. Some of us believe that what matters is the character you show every day, not whether you follow every social custom." Willow studied him for a moment. "Why did you help me back there, Mr. Galloway? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I've watched how you treat the children others have given up on. How you stay late helping Sarah Miller with her reading when most would have dismissed her as slow-witted. That tells me more about your character than whether you bow your head in church." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss O'Sullivan." Willow watched him walk away, his tall figure commanding attention as he moved down the street toward where his horse was hitched outside the general store. Their brief interaction had left her puzzled. Vaughn Galloway's reputation painted him as a serious, somewhat distant man who rarely involved himself in town matters beyond business. His decision to publicly support her seemed out of character, at least from what she'd heard. As she climbed the steps to her room, Willow wondered what consequences would follow from this morning's events for her position as teacher, her already tenuous place in the community. And now, for the unexpected ally she seemed to have found in the most influential man in Chisholm Ranch. The following morning, Willow arrived at the schoolhouse earlier than usual, her stomach knotted with anxiety. She'd spent a restless night anticipating empty desks and the potential consequences of her small act of defiance. The school board, chaired by Reverend Thompson, could easily dismiss her if enough parents complained. To her surprise, when the school bell rang at 8 o'clock, most of her students filed in as usual. The Hammond children were notably absent, as were the Miller's twins, but the remaining 15 students seemed unaffected by yesterday's events. As Willow began the morning lessons, she felt a small surge of hope that perhaps the repercussions wouldn't be as severe as she'd feared. That hope diminished at midday when Martha Jenkins, wife of the general store owner, arrived to collect her son Timothy. "I'm sorry, Miss O'Sullivan," Mrs. Jenkins said quietly, her eyes darting nervously around the classroom. "Robert insists that Timothy come home. There's talk of starting a petition about your suitability." Willow's heart sank, but she maintained her composure in front of the curious students. "I understand, Mrs. Jenkins. Timothy, please gather your things." By day's end, 3 more students had been withdrawn. Willow stood on the schoolhouse steps watching the remaining children disperse, wondering if she would have any pupils left by the end of the week. The thought of returning to Boston in defeat made her chest tighten with a mixture of anger and despair. She'd come west to escape the constraints of Eastern society, only to find the same rigid expectations in this small frontier town. Tough day. Willow turned to find Vaughn Galloway approaching on horseback, his massive black stallion kicking up dust as it came to a halt beside the schoolhouse. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "Word travels fast in Chisholm Ranch," Willow observed. "It's one of the less charming aspects of small-town life," he agreed, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I was on my way back from the Jenkins place and thought I'd stop by." "The Jenkins?" Willow asked, her interest piqued. "Timothy was withdrawn from school today." A slight smile crossed Vaughn's face. "I know. I just finished explaining to Robert Jenkins that I find it curious he would deny his son an education over something so trivial, especially when I'm considering which local businesses might best supply the new bunkhouse I'm building." Willow's eyes widened. "Mr. Galloway, are you saying you threatened Mr. Jenkins to keep his son in my school?" "Not threatened, Miss O'Sullivan. I simply shared my perspective on the value of a good education and the importance of separating church matters from schooling." His expression grew more serious. "Timothy will be back tomorrow, as will the Miller twins. I don't know whether to thank you or scold you for interfering," Willow said, torn between gratitude and pride. "Neither is necessary," Vaughn replied. "The children deserve better than to become pawns in a religious disagreement." Willow studied him, curiosity overriding her usual reserve. "You continue to surprise me, Mr. Galloway. From what I've heard, you rarely involve yourself in town disputes." "I prefer to mind my own business," he acknowledged, "but I have little patience for bullying, whether it comes wrapped in religious conviction or not." "And you don't share Reverend Thompson's opinions about proper worship?" Vaughn's gaze turned distant, looking past her toward the mountains that rimmed the eastern horizon. "I've seen too much of this world to believe God is interested in controlling how people approach him. My father was like Thompson believed in a wrathful God who demanded strict obedience. I found a different path after he died." Something in his tone suggested deeper waters than his casual words conveyed. Before Willow could respond, the schoolhouse door opened behind them and Sarah Miller emerged, her small face pinched with worry. "Miss O'Sullivan." "I forgot my reader," the 11-year-old explained, eyes widening at the sight of Vaughn. "Mr. Galloway, sir." Vaughn tipped his hat to the child. "Miss Sarah, how's your reading coming along?" Sarah's face brightened. "Miss O'Sullivan says I'm improving every day. I can read a whole page now without stopping." "That's quite an accomplishment," Vaughn said with genuine warmth. "Your father must be proud." The girl's smile faltered. "Pa says I might not be coming back to school anymore. He and Ma were arguing about it last night." Willow knelt to meet the child's eyes. Don't worry about that right now, Sarah. Just focus on practicing your reading at home and we'll sort everything out. After Sarah retrieved her book and departed, Willow turned back to Vaughn, her expression troubled. I won't have children caught in the middle of this. Perhaps I should speak with Reverend Thompson, find some compromise. And what compromise would that be? Vaughn asked gently. Would you agree to bow your head while believing it unnecessary? Start living a life of small hypocrisies to please others. When you put it that way, it sounds impossible, Willow admitted. Not impossible, he corrected. Just costly. Every time we pretend to be something we're not, we lose a piece of ourselves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as they stood in thoughtful silence. Finally, Vaughn said, I'm hosting a small gathering at my ranch this Saturday, just a few neighbors and friends. Nothing formal. I'd like you to come. Willow hesitated, surprised by the unexpected invitation. I'm not sure that would be wise, given current circumstances. That's precisely why it would be wise, Vaughn countered. It would give people a chance to know you outside of church and school. Martha Jenkins will be there. She makes the best apple pie in the territory, and Judge Parker is riding in from Santa Fe. The territorial judge, Willow asked, impressed despite herself. An old friend, Vaughn explained. He appreciates good conversation and fresh perspectives. I think you'd enjoy meeting him. He paused, then added with a hint of mischief, and I guarantee no one will ask you to bow your head. A reluctant smile tugged at Willow's lips. I'll consider it. My foreman will drive into town to collect anyone needing transportation, around 4 o'clock. Willow nodded, still uncertain but finding herself unable to refuse. Thank you, Mr. Galloway. Vaughn, he corrected. If we're going to scandalize the town together, we might as well be on a first-name basis. After he departed, Willow remained on the schoolhouse steps, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared around the bend. Something about Vaughn Galloway defied the expectations she'd formed based on town gossip. The wealthy rancher was said to be aloof and intensely private, yet he'd intervened on her behalf twice now, risking his own standing in the community. As she gathered her teaching materials and locked the schoolhouse, Willow wondered what Saturday would bring, and why the prospect of spending more time with Vaughn Galloway left her feeling both apprehensive and inexplicably hopeful. The days that followed brought a gradual return of students to Willow's classroom. By Friday, only the Hammond children remained absent, though several parents were noticeably cooler during their brief interactions at the schoolhouse door. Reverend Thompson had made no further direct approaches, but Willow had noticed him observing the school from a distance on Wednesday afternoon, his expression unreadable. On Saturday morning, Willow found herself standing before her small wardrobe, contemplating her limited options with uncharacteristic indecision. Her teaching dresses were serviceable but plain, and the one formal gown she'd brought from Boston felt too elaborate for what Vaughn had described as a small gathering. Finally, she selected a dress of soft green cotton, one of the few concessions to vanity she'd allowed herself when preparing for her western journey. The color complemented her auburn hair, and while the cut was modest, the fabric draping gave it a certain elegance beyond her everyday wear. At precisely 4 o'clock, a wagon bearing the Galloway Ranch brand pulled up before the boarding house. To Willow's surprise, Mrs. Abernathy emerged from her own room down the hall at the same moment. Miss O'Sullivan, are you also attending Mr. Galloway's gathering? The older woman asked, her tone suggesting she found this coincidence remarkable. I am, Willow confirmed, gathering her shawl. I didn't realize you were acquainted with Mr. Galloway. Oh, my late husband did business with the Galloways for years, Mrs. Abernathy explained as they descended the stairs together. Vaughn always extends an invitation to these seasonal gatherings of his, though I must admit I was surprised he maintained the tradition after. She stopped abruptly. After what? Willow prompted. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated before lowering her voice. It's not my place to gossip, but since you're new to town, Vaughn was engaged to be married 3 years ago. Eleanor Whitcomb, from one of the finest families in Santa Fe. The wedding was to be at the ranch, everything arranged down to the last detail. 2 weeks before the ceremony, she changed her mind. Ran off with a lawyer from back east. Willow absorbed this information in silence as they approached the wagon, where a weathered man in his 50s waited patiently at the reins. "Afternoon, ladies," he greeted them, touching the brim of his hat. "Jim Harker, foreman at Galloway Ranch. Looks like you're my last passengers. We've got the Jenkins family and Judge Parker already aboard." The journey to the ranch took nearly an hour, winding through increasingly rugged terrain. As they crested a final hill, Galloway Ranch spread before them, a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a verdant valley, with mountains rising dramatically behind it. A 2-story main house of stone and timber dominated the landscape, flanked by a series of outbuildings, corrals, and what appeared to be a newly constructed bunkhouse. "It's magnificent," Willow murmured, taking in the unexpected grandeur. "Impressive, isn't it, Mrs. Abernathy said with pride, as though she personally had some stake in the property. Vaughn's father started with nothing but a land claim and a dozen head of cattle. Now, it's one of the largest operations in the territory. As the wagon approached, Willow saw several other vehicles already parked near the house. Groups of people conversed on the wide porch that wrapped around the building, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted on the evening breeze. "Small gathering, indeed," Willow remarked, counting at least 20 guests already present. The wagon came to a halt, and Jim helped the ladies descend. Willow had barely set foot on the ground when Vaughn appeared, looking markedly different from their previous encounters. Gone was the dusty trail clothing, replaced by a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and well-tailored trousers. His hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock had already fallen across his forehead. "Mrs. Abernathy, Miss O'Sullivan," he greeted them warmly. "I'm delighted you could join us." "Such a lovely invitation, Vaughn," Mrs. Abernathy gushed. "I was just telling Miss O'Sullivan about your father's humble beginnings." "Nothing humble about my father, including his beginnings," Vaughn replied with a wry smile. "But he did work hard for what he built." He turned to Willow. "Would you allow me to show you around? Some of the views from the property are particularly striking at this hour." "That would be lovely," Willow agreed, aware of Mrs. Abernathy's curious gaze following them as Vaughn guided her away from the gathered guests. "You look different," Vaughn observed as they walked along a stone path that wound behind the main house. "As do you," Willow replied. "I hardly recognized you without a layer of trail dust." He laughed, a rich sound that caught her by surprise. "I clean up reasonably well when necessary, though I admit I prefer the trail. Too many people make me restless." "Then why host a gathering like this? Tradition, mostly. My mother started these seasonal parties years ago, said it was important to be a good neighbor, even this far from town." A shadow crossed his features. She believed in bringing people together. They rounded a bend in the path, and Willow gasped softly. Before them stretched a natural terrace overlooking the entire valley, with mountains painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun. A single bench had been placed at the edge, offering an unobstructed view of the breathtaking panorama. "Your mother chose a magnificent location for her home," Willow said, moving toward the bench. "She did," Vaughn agreed, joining her. Swedish immigrant who'd never seen mountains until she came west, said they made her feel closer to God. Is that why you defended me at church? Because of her influence? Vaughn was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Partly. My mother had her own way of worshiping that didn't always align with local customs. But mostly, I spoke up because I've seen too much of people using religion as a weapon. Your father, Willow ventured, remembering his earlier comment. Vaughn nodded. A devout man who believed salvation required suffering. Every misfortune was God's test or punishment. His voice grew distant. When my mother fell ill, he refused a doctor for 3 days, insisting prayer was the only appropriate response. That's terrible, Willow said softly. Did she? She survived that illness, died of pneumonia 2 winters later. His expression softened. She used to tell me that God gave us minds to think and hearts to feel, and dishonoring either was the only true blasphemy. She sounds remarkable. She was. Vaughn's gaze shifted to Willow. When I saw you standing in that church, head high while everyone else bent low, you reminded me of her. Same quiet defiance. The personal admission caught Willow off guard, warmth spreading through her chest at the unexpected comparison. Before she could respond, voices approached on the path behind them. Vaughn, there you are, called a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s. Your man Harker said we might find you showing Miss O'Sullivan the property. Vaughn stood to greet the newcomer. Judge Parker, may I present Miss Willow O'Sullivan, Chisholm Ranch's schoolteacher. Miss O'Sullivan, Judge William Parker of the Territorial Court. A pleasure, Miss O'Sullivan, the judge said, bowing slightly. I've heard much about the new breath of fresh air in our little community. All good things, I hope, Willow replied with a smile. Spirited debate is the foundation of a healthy society, Judge Parker said, his eyes twinkling. Though I understand Reverend Thompson may not share my enthusiasm for intellectual discourse. The Reverend has strong convictions, Willow said diplomatically, as do you by all accounts. The judge chuckled. Vaughn tells me you've caused quite a stir with your approach to prayer. I believe in honoring God with authenticity rather than conformity, Willow said, lifting her chin slightly. Well said, Judge Parker exclaimed. Reminds me of my late wife. She once told a circuit preacher that if God wanted women silent in church, he wouldn't have given them voices that could sing higher than the men. Their conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell, and the 3 made their way back to the main house. As they approached, Willow became aware of curious glances directed their way. She'd been sequestered with Vaughn long enough for it to be noticed, particularly in a community where such interactions between unmarried men and women were subject to scrutiny. Dinner was served in the spacious dining room, with additional tables set up in the adjacent parlor to accommodate all the guests. Willow found herself seated between Judge Parker and Martha Jenkins, with Vaughn at the head of the table. The meal was surprisingly refined for a frontier-setting roast beef, fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden, and bread still warm from the oven. Throughout the evening, Willow observed Vaughn in this new context. He moved among his guests with quiet confidence, attentive to everyone from the territorial judge to Jim Harker's young daughter, who had been invited to join the adults at dinner. There was none of the forced bonhomie or subtle status signaling Willow had often witnessed at Boston gatherings. When he spoke, people listened not out of obligation to their host, but genuine interest. As the evening progressed into dancing and conversation in the large parlor, Willow found herself drawn into discussions with various guests, many of whom seemed more welcoming than they had been in town. Whether Vaughn's obvious approval had influenced their attitudes or the neutral setting allowed for greater openness, she couldn't be sure, but the change was noticeable. "Miss O'Sullivan," Martha Jenkins approached hesitantly as Willow stood near the punch bowl. "I wanted to apologize for withdrawing Timothy from school earlier this week. It wasn't my choice." "I understand, Mrs. Jenkins," Willow assured her. "Family decisions are complex. Robert can be stubborn, but he's not unreasonable," Martha continued. "Once Mr. Galloway spoke with him." She paused. "Well, let's just say he reconsidered his position." "Timothy is a bright boy," Willow said. "I'm glad he'll continue his education." "He talks about your lessons constantly," Martha confided. "Even tried explaining long division to his father last night." She lowered her voice. "Between us, I think Robert was more impressed by that than by anything Reverend Thompson had to say." As the evening drew to a close, several of the guests with longer journeys home began to depart. Willow found herself lingering, reluctant to end what had been the most pleasant social experience she'd had since arriving in the territory. "I noticed you didn't join the dancing," Vaughn said, appearing beside her as she stood watching several couples circling to the music of a fiddle and piano. "I haven't danced in quite some time," Willow admitted. "Not since before my father fell ill." "Would you make an exception tonight?" he asked, offering his hand. "This will likely be the last song." Willow hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I might be terribly out of practice. Fortunately, I lead well enough to make anyone look accomplished," Vaughn replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. The musicians had indeed begun a final waltz, its gentle rhythm filling the room as Vaughn led Willow to the center of the improvised dance floor. His hand at her waist was firm but respectful, and as they began to move with the music, Willow was surprised by how naturally they fell into rhythm together. "You dance beautifully for a man who spends most of his time on horseback," she observed. "My mother insisted I learn," he explained. "Said a gentleman should be as comfortable in a ballroom as on the range. She taught you well." As they circled the room, Willow became aware of glances from the remaining guests, some curious, others speculative. Mrs. Abernathy watched with particular intensity, her expression a mixture of surprise and calculation. "I believe we're causing another scandal," Willow murmured. "Let them talk," Vaughn replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It gives them something to do on long evenings." The music drew to a close, and Vaughn stepped back, bowing formally as tradition dictated. When he straightened, his eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Thank you for coming tonight, Willow," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Would you allow me to accompany you back to town? What about your other guests? Jim can see to their transportation. I'd prefer to drive you myself if you're willing." The drive back to Chisholm Ranch was filled with comfortable conversation, the night air cool but pleasant as their buggy followed the moonlit trail. Vaughn pointed out constellations overhead, sharing stories his mother had taught him about the stars. Willow found herself laughing more than she had in months, the tension of recent days temporarily forgotten. As they neared town, however, her thoughts returned to the challenges that awaited. "What happens now?" she asked. "I doubt Reverend Thompson's opinions have changed in my absence." "Probably not," Vaughn agreed. "But opinions don't dictate truth, Willow. You have more allies than you realize. Because of your influence," she pointed out. "Some, perhaps, but others because they've seen your character for themselves." He slowed the horses as they approached the boarding house. "Judge Parker was impressed by you, and his opinion carries considerable weight. And the Jenkins seem to have softened their position." "Until the next church service," Willow said, unable to keep the note of resignation from her voice. Vaughn brought the buggy to a halt and turned to face her. May I ask you something personal? Willow nodded, curious. Why is this particular stand so important to you? Of all the battles one might choose. She considered his question seriously. When my father was dying, she finally said, he spent his last weeks in agony. The minister visited daily, instructing him to bow his head in submission to God's will, to accept his suffering as divine judgment. Her voice grew tight with emotion. On his final night, when the pain was at its worst, my father looked up at the ceiling and cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" Do you know what the minister said? Vaughn shook his head silently. He said my father's suffering was prolonged because he questioned God instead of submitting. Willow's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I watched my father die believing he'd failed at faith because he couldn't pretend his pain was a blessing. I'm so sorry, Vaughn said softly. That night, I made a promise to myself that I would never bow my head out of fear or pretense. That if God exists as I want to believe he does, he would rather have my honest face turned toward him than my head lowered in false submission. Vaughn reached out, gently covering her hand with his. Thank you for telling me. I've never shared that with anyone before, Willow admitted, surprised by her own openness. I'm honored by your trust, he replied. His hand remained on hers, warm and steady in the cool night air. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words or common experience. Then, mindful of propriety, Vaughn stepped down from the buggy and came around to assist her. As she placed her hands on his shoulders and felt his gentle guidance to the ground, Willow was acutely aware of his strength and the careful respect with which he handled her. Thank you for a lovely evening, she said as they reached the boarding house steps. Would you allow me to call on you properly? Vaughn asked, his direct question catching her by surprise. Perhaps next Sunday after church. The mention of church reminded Willow of the inevitable confrontation awaiting her. If I'm still employed and welcome in this town by then, I would like that very much. Vaughn's expression grew serious. Whatever happens, Willow, you won't face it alone. As she watched him drive away, Willow wondered at the swift transformation of her circumstances. In the span of a week, she had gone from isolated newcomer to the center of controversy, and perhaps to the beginning of something she hadn't dared hope for since arriving in this frontier town. Sunday arrived with an unseasonably warm breeze that carried the scent of desert sage through Willow's open window. She dressed with particular care, selecting a modest dove-gray dress that would attract minimal attention. Though tempted to avoid church entirely, she knew absence would only strengthen Reverend Thompson's position and likely jeopardize her teaching position further. Mrs. Abernathy intercepted her in the hallway, expression conspiratorial. My dear, you made quite an impression at the Galloway ranch yesterday. I haven't seen Vaughn dance with anyone since Alina left him at the altar. We shared one dance as host and guest, Willow demurred, uncomfortable with the speculation in the older woman's tone. Of course, dear Mrs. Abernathy replied, clearly unconvinced. Though I must say, you two made a striking pair, and that private conversation on the terrace. She let the sentence hang suggestively. Willow straightened her spine. Mr. Galloway was simply showing me the view, which was magnificent. Now, shall we proceed to church? The walk to the small white building seemed shorter than usual, anxiety hastening Willow's steps, despite her attempts to remain composed. As they approached, she noticed a larger crowd than the previous Sunday, including several faces she didn't recognize. Word of your stance has traveled to neighboring settlements, Mrs. Abernathy whispered, noting Willow's questioning glance. People are curious. Willow's stomach tightened. Wonderful, an audience. Inside, The church was indeed more crowded than usual, with every pew filled and additional chairs placed along the walls. Willow followed Mrs. Abernathy to a seat near the middle, aware of the whispers and stares that followed her progress. Several of her students waved shyly, including Timothy Jenkins, whose presence heartened her slightly. Just as Reverend Thompson approached the pulpit, the church door opened once more, and a ripple of murmurs swept through the congregation as Vaughn Galloway entered. Though he regularly attended services, his appearance today, the Sunday after he'd openly supported Willow, carried obvious significance. What surprised Willow most was not his presence but his companions. Judge Parker and Jim Harker flanked him as they made their way down the aisle. The only remaining space was directly behind Willow, and as Vaughn took his seat, she felt his presence like a physical force at her back. Reverend Thompson's gaze flickered over the late arrivals before he cleared his throat and began the service. His sermon that morning focused on the theme of community and unity of purpose, emphasizing the importance of shared values and traditions. Though he made no direct reference to the previous Sunday's incident, the implications were clear in phrases about disruptive influences and the dangers of pride disguised as independence. When the time came for communal prayer, Willow felt the congregation's attention shift to her. Reverend Thompson's eyes met hers directly as he intoned, "Let us bow our heads and humble ourselves before the Lord." Willow remained upright, her breathing carefully controlled as heads lowered all around her. She was prepared for the disapproval, the judgment that would surely follow. What she wasn't prepared for was the soft shuffle behind her and the realization that Vaughn Galloway had also remained upright. A glance revealed that Judge Parker and Jim Harker had done the same. Reverend Thompson faltered momentarily, his rhythm disrupted by this unexpected development. He recovered quickly, but his prayer seemed rushed, his usual eloquence diminished by what could only be interpreted as a silent rebellion among his flock. When the final amen sounded, Willow turned to find Vaughn watching her with quiet intensity. He gave her a slight nod acknowledgement rather than approval, as if to say her choices were her own, but she wasn't alone in making them. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Timothy Jenkins abruptly stood tall while his parents and siblings bowed their heads for the benediction. Then Sarah Miller, her small face determined, straightened in her seat. By the time Reverend Thompson raised his head, 7 people, including Martha Jenkins herself, were standing straight, faces forward. The Reverend's expression tightened, but he completed the service without comment. As the congregation began to disperse, he made his way directly to where Willow stood with Vaughn and the others who had joined her silent statement. "Mr. Galloway," Reverend Thompson began, his voice tightly controlled, "I'm surprised to see you encouraging this disruption." "I wasn't aware that standing before God constituted disruption, Reverend," Vaughn replied evenly. "You know very well what I mean. This defiance of tradition, with respect," Judge Parker interrupted. "Tradition without purpose becomes mere ritual, and ritual without meaning becomes oppression." "This is a matter of church discipline, Your Honor, not law," Reverend Thompson countered. "Indeed," the judge agreed, "which is why it should be addressed with spiritual wisdom rather than authoritarian demands." The Reverend's face flushed. "The school board meets tomorrow evening. Miss O'Sullivan's conduct will be discussed. As chairman of that board, you might want to consider how the community would view the dismissal of an effective teacher over a matter of prayer posture," Vaughn said quietly. "Particularly when several respected citizens and parents have now demonstrated their agreement with her position." Martha Jenkins stepped forward, her usual timidity replaced with unexpected resolve. "Reverend," My Timothy has learned more in 3 months with Miss O'Sullivan than in 2 years with the previous teacher. I won't have his education sacrificed over this." Murmurs of agreement came from several nearby parents. Reverend Thompson looked from face to face, clearly recognizing that what had begun as one woman's solitary stand had somehow transformed into a community question. "The board will consider all perspectives," he finally said, his tone clipped. "Good day." As he walked away, Willow turned to the small group that had formed around her. "I don't know what to say. I never intended to create division. Sometimes standing for what you believe means others have to choose where they stand too," Judge Parker observed. "It's not division so much as clarification." "Still," Willow said, "I never expected anyone else to join me." "Maybe that's why they did," Vaughn suggested, "because it wasn't a campaign or a crusade, just one person's honest expression of faith." The group dispersed gradually, with several parents stopping to express support for Willow's teaching, regardless of their opinion on the prayer issue. Eventually, only Vaughn remained, standing with her in the shade of the old oak tree as the church emptied. "That was unexpected," Willow said, still processing what had occurred. "Was it?" Vaughn asked. "You've touched more lives than you realize in your short time here. The children adore you, and their parents have noticed the difference in them." Still, to risk Reverend Thompson's disapproval. "Some things matter more than avoiding conflict." Vaughn offered his arm. "May I walk you home?" As they strolled through town, Willow was acutely aware of eyes following their progress from windows and porches. Their public association, particularly after the events at church, would certainly fuel speculation. Yet she found herself caring less than she might have a week earlier. "The school board meets tomorrow," she said as they approached the boarding house. Despite what happened today, Reverend Thompson still has considerable influence. "He does," Vaughn agreed. "But he's also a practical man beneath his religious fervor. The school has struggled to keep teachers willing to stay in a small frontier town. He knows replacing you would be difficult, especially now that you have public support." They paused at the bottom of the steps, the midday sun casting dappled shadows through the cottonwood branches overhead. Vaughn turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I meant what I said about calling on you properly." He hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "I've lived a solitary life since Alina left, thought it was simpler that way. But this past week has reminded me that simplicity isn't always the same as living fully." Willow's heart quickened at his words. "Vaughn, you don't need to respond now," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know that my interest goes beyond this current situation. Whether you stay as teacher or find another path, I would like the chance to know you better." Before she could formulate a response, Mrs. Abernathy appeared at the doorway above them, her timing suspiciously convenient. "Miss O'Sullivan, Mr. Galloway, would you care to join me for Sunday dinner? I've made far too much chicken and dumplings for one person." Vaughn smiled up at the older woman. "Another time, perhaps, Mrs. Abernathy. I have ranch matters requiring my attention this afternoon." He turned back to Willow. "Until tomorrow." As he walked away, Willow climbed the steps to where Mrs. Abernathy waited, her expression knowing. "My dear, I believe you've accomplished what half the eligible young women in 3 counties have failed to do." Captured Vaughn Galloway's attention. "We share certain perspectives, that's all," Willow demurred, though she couldn't quite suppress the warmth that spread through her at the thought of his words. "Of course," Mrs. Abernathy agreed, patently disbelieving. "Now, come tell me everything about last night's drive home while we eat." Did he mention Alina at all? The school board meeting convened the following evening in the town hall, a grand name for what was essentially the largest room in the general store, partitioned off for civic purposes. Willow arrived early, determined to present herself with dignity regardless of the outcome. To her surprise, the room was already half full, with more townspeople filing in steadily. "Word spread that your position was being discussed," Martha Jenkins explained, appearing at Willow's side. Many parents wanted to be present. Reverend Thompson arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by the other 4 board members: Robert Jenkins, Sheriff Miller, elderly Dr. Whitman, and Franklin Parsons, who owned the livery stable. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to resignation as they took their seats at the front table, clearly unprepared for the size of the audience. "This meeting of the Chisholm Ranch School Board is now in session," Reverend Thompson announced, his gaze sweeping over the crowded room. "We have several matters on our agenda, but I understand many of you are here regarding Miss O'Sullivan's continued employment." A murmur of confirmation swept through the room. "In the interest of transparency, we will address this matter first," the Reverend continued. "Miss O'Sullivan, would you please step forward?" Willow rose, smoothing her skirts before approaching the table. She had prepared a statement defending her teaching record and explaining her position. But before she could speak, the door opened once more and Vaughn entered, followed by Judge Parker. They took positions at the back of the room, Vaughn's presence a silent statement of support that bolstered Willow's resolve. "Miss O'Sullivan," Reverend Thompson began, "concerns have been raised about certain behaviors that some believe undermine your effectiveness as a role model for the community's children. Specifically, your refusal to observe customary practices during worship services has created disruption and division." "If I may respond," Willow said calmly, "in a moment. First, as chairman, I wish to note that while personal religious expression is a private matter, teachers hold positions of public trust and influence. Their conduct, both in and out of the classroom, must reflect community standards." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Thomas, perhaps we should hear Miss O'Sullivan's perspective before proceeding further." Reverend Thompson nodded stiffly. "Very well. Miss O'Sullivan, you may address the board." Willow took a deep breath, surveying the room before beginning. "When I accepted the position as teacher in Chisholm Ranch, I committed to educating your children to the best of my ability to help them develop the knowledge, skills, and character needed for whatever future they might choose. That commitment has guided every lesson I've taught and every interaction I've had with my students." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My personal approach to prayer reflects my deeply held belief that honesty before God is more important than conformity to social expectations. I have never discussed this belief with my students, nor have I encouraged them to adopt my practices. I simply stood before God as my conscience dictated. Yet your example led others, including children, to similar acts of disrespect," Reverend Thompson interjected. "With respect, Reverend, I cannot control how others interpret or respond to my personal religious expression," Willow countered. "If standing upright during prayer is considered disrespectful, I wonder what Christ himself would say, given that he often prayed with eyes raised to heaven." A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. Biblical references were Reverend Thompson's usual territory, not territory to be claimed by others in public debate. "Furthermore," Willow continued, "in the 3 months I've served as teacher, reading proficiency has improved by 20% among students who previously struggled. Attendance has been consistent, and several children who had stopped attending altogether have returned to school." Dr. Whitman, the oldest board member, leaned forward. "That matches what I've observed, Miss O'Sullivan. Sarah Miller's improvement has been remarkable. Her mother tells me the child reads to her younger siblings every evening now. Franklin Parsons nodded. My grandson included mathematics in his prayers last week, thanking God he finally understood fractions. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Reverend Thompson's expression remained stern. Academic progress, while commendable, doesn't negate the importance of moral example. If I may, a new voice spoke from the back of the room. Judge Parker stepped forward. As someone who travels throughout the territory visiting many communities, I can attest that qualified teachers willing to commit to frontier towns are exceedingly rare. Miss O'Sullivan has demonstrated both competence and dedication in her role. To dismiss her over a matter of personal religious expression would seem both impractical and potentially contrary to the principles of religious liberty upon which this nation was founded. This isn't a legal proceeding, Your Honor, Reverend Thompson said tightly. No, but it is a matter of community governance, the judge replied. And wise governance considers both principle and practical impact. Robert Jenkins, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. My Timothy talks about school constantly now. Never did before. And Martha tells me Miss O'Sullivan stays late 3 days a week helping children who need extra attention without additional compensation. The mood in the room had shifted perceptibly. Even those who might have disagreed with Willow's stance on prayer seemed reluctant to lose a teacher who had proven so effective. Perhaps, Sheriff Miller suggested, we might consider a compromise. Miss O'Sullivan could continue teaching while agreeing to what exactly? Vaughn's voice cut through the room as he stepped forward. Pretend to believe something she doesn't. Act against her conscience to satisfy others' expectations. He addressed the entire room now, not just the board. I've lived in this community my entire life. We've weathered drought, disease, and conflict by standing together despite our differences. Are we now suggesting that uniformity in prayer posture is more important than integrity, more valuable than having an excellent teacher for our children? A long silence followed his words. Finally, Dr. Whitman spoke. I move that we table this discussion and affirm Miss O'Sullivan's continued employment, subject to the same standards of professional conduct that have always governed the position, namely, competent instruction and appropriate behavior toward students. I second, Franklin Parsons said quickly. Those in favor? Dr. Whitman asked. Sheriff Miller and Robert Jenkins raised their hands alongside Dr. Whitman and Franklin. Only Reverend Thompson abstained, his expression a mixture of resignation and displeasure. Motion carried, Dr. Whitman announced. Miss O'Sullivan, you continue to have the board's confidence as teacher. Relief washed over Willow, so profound she momentarily closed her eyes. When she opened them, her gaze found Vaughn's across the room. His slight smile conveyed both congratulations and something more personal, a connection that had deepened through shared challenge. The meeting continued with other matters, but most of the audience dispersed once Willow's position was secured. Outside, well-wishers surrounded her, offering congratulations and support. By the time she extricated herself, twilight had settled over the town, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. May I walk you home? Vaughn asked, materializing at her side as the crowd thinned. I would like that, Willow replied, still processing the evening's events. They walked in companionable silence for several minutes before Vaughn spoke. You were impressive in there, clear, principled, but not self-righteous. I kept thinking about what you said, that God hears us standing tall. It reminded me that this wasn't about defiance but about honesty. Reverend Thompson will come around eventually, Vaughn predicted. He's stubborn but not malicious, and he does care about the children's education. I hope so, Willow said. I've grown fond of this place despite the challenges. They reached the boarding house steps, pausing in the gathering darkness. Lanterns had been lit in windows along the street, casting pools of warm light that seemed to emphasize the intimacy of the moment. Would you have left? Vaughn asked quietly, if the decision had gone differently. Willow considered the question. I don't know. I came here seeking independence and purpose. I've found both in teaching these children. But I also promised myself I wouldn't compromise my integrity to please others, not after watching what happened to my father. I'm glad you stayed, Vaughn said simply. Very glad. In the soft lamplight, his features seemed more open than usual, the habitual reserve giving way to something more vulnerable. Willow felt a powerful urge to reach out, to bridge the small physical distance between them that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the connection forming between their minds and hearts. Before she could act on the impulse, the boarding house door opened, spilling light onto the porch. Mrs. Abernathy appeared, a letter in hand. Miss O'Sullivan, a message arrived for you this afternoon from Santa Fe, she called, then noticed Vaughn. Oh, good evening, Mr. Galloway. Lovely to see you again. The moment broken, Willow took a step toward the stairs. Thank you for your support tonight, Vaughn. It meant a great deal. I'll call on you Sunday if that's still agreeable, he asked. Very much so. As she climbed the steps and accepted the letter from Mrs. Abernathy, Willow felt a curious mixture of emotions: gratitude for the community's ultimate support, hope for her continued role as teacher, and something new and exhilarating whenever she thought of Vaughn Galloway and the promise of Sunday's visit. The following weeks brought a gradual easing of tensions in Chisholm Ranch. Though Reverend Thompson remained cool toward Willow, he no longer made pointed remarks during services, and the remaining parents who had withdrawn their children returned them to school. The controversy over standing during prayer gradually evolved into a matter of personal choice, with a small but growing number of congregants choosing to remain upright during prayer, a quiet revolution in a community previously bound by rigid conformity. Vaughn called on Willow each Sunday as promised, their outings progressing from afternoon walks to longer excursions on horseback, exploring the magnificent landscape surrounding Chisholm Ranch. On these rides, away from the scrutiny of the town, they spoke freely about everything from literature to politics to their hopes for the territory's future. I've been corresponding with an architect in Santa Fe, Vaughn mentioned during one such ride in late June, as they rested their horses beside a clear mountain stream, about building a proper school building to replace the current one. That's a wonderful idea, Willow said, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Though I've grown rather fond of our little schoolhouse despite its limitations. The town is growing, Vaughn observed. The railroad will reach us within 2 years, according to the latest surveys. More families will follow. And more children needing education, Willow agreed. Perhaps even a second teacher eventually. Vaughn nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've been considering donating the land at the north edge of town where the old Miller cabin stood before the fire. It's a good location, central but with room for a proper playground. That's incredibly generous, Willow said, touched by his commitment to the community's future. I have selfish motivations, Vaughn admitted with a half-smile. I want the children of this territory to have opportunities my generation didn't, to learn about the wider world while still appreciating this one. Is that why you have so many books? Willow asked. During her visits to the ranch, she'd been astonished by Vaughn's extensive library, containing volumes on subjects ranging from Greek philosophy to modern engineering. Partly, he acknowledged. My mother valued education above almost everything except faith. She taught me to read from the Bible and Shakespeare before I was 6. His expression softened with memory. After she died, books became a connection to her, a way to continue the conversations we'd had. These glimpses into Vaughn's past had become increasingly frequent as their relationship deepened. Willow had shared her own history as well, her childhood in Boston, her father's progressive views on women's education, and the painful final years of his illness that had ultimately sent her west in search of a new beginning. As summer progressed toward autumn, their growing attachment became the subject of inevitable town speculation. Mrs. Abernathy took particular delight in casually mentioning Vaughn's name in conversations, watching for Willow's reaction. Martha Jenkins began sending additional treats in Timothy's lunch, ostensibly for the teacher, but always with questions about Mr. Galloway's recent visits. One evening in early September, as they returned from a community gathering at Judge Parker's temporary lodgings, Vaughn guided their buggy to a scenic overlook rather than directly back to town. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the valley, illuminating the landscape in ethereal light. "Do you miss Boston?" Vaughn asked unexpectedly as they sat watching the moonrise. The question caught Willow by surprise. "Sometimes," she admitted. "The libraries, the lectures, the sense of being at the center of ideas and progress." She turned to study his profile in the moonlight. "But I've found things here I never had there, such as—" His voice was carefully neutral, but she sensed an underlying tension in the question. "Space to breathe, freedom to define myself beyond social expectations." She paused, gathering courage. "People who value honesty above conformity." Vaughn's hand found hers in the darkness. "I've been thinking about Alina recently." The mention of his former fiancée sent a chill through Willow despite the warmth of his hand on hers. "Oh, not in the way you might think," he clarified quickly. "I realized something important while talking with Judge Parker last week. Alina leaving was painful, but it wasn't the loss of love that hurt most, it was the public humiliation, the feeling that I'd been judged and found wanting." "I'm sure that wasn't it was," Vaughn interrupted gently. "She was honest enough to admit it in her letter. Said she'd agreed to marry me because of my position, my property, but ultimately couldn't face life so far from civilization with someone she considered unpolished. She was wrong," Willow said with unexpected fierceness. "About all of it." Vaughn's fingers tightened around hers. "What I realized talking with Judge Parker was that I'd been so focused on avoiding another public rejection that I'd closed myself off from any possibility of genuine connection. Until you stood in that church, head high when everyone else bowed low." He turned toward her, his free hand coming up to gently trace the curve of her cheek. "You reminded me that the opinions that matter most are those of people who see us clearly, not those who judge us according to their own expectations." Willow's heart raced at his touch, at the intensity in his voice. "Vaughn, I'm not asking anything of you tonight," he said softly, "except that you know I'm falling in love with you, Willow O'Sullivan. Not for what you represent, or how you might complement my position, but for who you are, stubborn convictions and all." The simple honesty of his declaration took her breath away. In Boston, courtships had been conducted through elaborate rituals and careful negotiations between families. Nothing had prepared her for the directness of this man who spoke his heart without artifice or calculation. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to say anything yet," Vaughn assured her. "I just wanted you to know where I stand before I speak with Reverend Thompson." "Reverend Thompson," Willow repeated, confused. A smile tugged at Vaughn's mouth. "Traditional in some ways, remember. If I'm going to court you properly, I should inform him as your spiritual advisor. Despite our disagreements, he is still the minister of this community." The formality of the gesture touched Willow deeply. "And if he disapproves, then I'll court you anyway," Vaughn said with a shrug. "But I suspect he'll appreciate the respect shown to his position, even if he remains skeptical of your theological perspectives." Willow laughed softly. "You continue to surprise me, Vaughn Galloway." "I hope to do so for many years to come," he replied, his voice rich with meaning that sent warmth spreading through her chest. Under the harvest moon, with the vast landscape spread before them like a promise of possibilities, Vaughn leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Willow closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that felt both inevitable and revolutionary, the natural culmination of a connection that had begun with an act of quiet defiance in a small frontier church. When they finally parted, Willow whispered, "I'm falling in love with you too. Not for your defense of me or your position in this community, but for your kindness, your integrity, and the way you see the world and me so clearly." The Autumn Harvest Festival had long been Chisholm Ranch's most significant community celebration, bringing together families from outlying homesteads and neighboring settlements for 3 days of feasting, contests, and trading. This year, the festival held special significance for Willow, marking not only her first full cycle of seasons in the territory, but also her first public appearance as Vaughn Galloway's acknowledged sweetheart. True to his word, Vaughn had spoken with Reverend Thompson before formally beginning his courtship. To everyone's surprise, including Willow's, the minister had offered his blessing, albeit with a certain resigned pragmatism. "Perhaps," he told Vaughn, "your influence will temper Miss O'Sullivan's more progressive inclinations." Vaughn had wisely refrained from suggesting it might work in the opposite direction. The morning of the festival's opening day dawned clear and cool, with aspen trees along the mountains turning brilliant gold against the evergreen backdrop. Willow stood before her small mirror, assessing her appearance with unusual care. She'd used some of her carefully saved earnings to purchase fabric for a new dress, a rich burgundy wool that complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion. Mrs. Abernathy had helped with the styling, incorporating fashionable details, while maintaining the practicality required for frontier life. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Abernathy declared, making final adjustments to Willow's hair. "Vaughn won't know what hit him." "It's only a harvest festival," Willow demurred, though she couldn't suppress a pleased smile at her reflection. "It's the first time you'll be seen together as a proper couple," Mrs. Abernathy corrected. "Everyone will be watching." "How comforting," Willow replied dryly, though she knew the older woman was right. Their courtship, while conducted with propriety, had become the favorite topic of local conversation. Eleanor Whitcomb's abandonment had made Vaughn an object of sympathy in the territory. His choice of the controversial schoolteacher as her replacement added an irresistible dramatic element to the narrative. Vaughn arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed more formally than his usual ranch attire in a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and his best coat. His eyes widened appreciatively when Willow appeared on the boarding house porch. "You are a vision, Miss O'Sullivan," he said, taking her gloved hand and raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that sent color rushing to her cheeks. "You're looking quite distinguished yourself, Mr. Galloway," she returned, accepting his arm as they began walking toward the town square where the festival was centered. The transformation of Chisholm Ranch's Main Street was impressive. Colorful bunting stretched between buildings. Stalls lined both sides of the thoroughfare, offering everything from handcrafted goods to agricultural produce. and a large area had been cleared for dancing later in the day. A judging table displayed pies, preserves, and handwork, competing for ribbons and modest cash prizes. Their arrival together drew the expected attention, with conversations pausing momentarily and heads turning to observe their progress through the festivities. Willow felt a moment of self-consciousness before Vaughn's steady presence beside her restored her confidence. "Miss O'Sullivan," Sarah Miller called, breaking away from her parents to rush toward them. "Do you like my new dress? Ma made it special for the festival." "You look lovely, Sarah," Willow replied warmly, admiring the child's blue calico dress adorned with white ribbon. "Pa says I'm to recite the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere at the program tomorrow," Sarah confided, practically bouncing with excitement. "He said since you taught me to read so well, I should show everyone." Sheriff Miller approached, looking slightly embarrassed by his daughter's enthusiasm. "If that's agreeable to you, Miss O'Sullivan. Sarah's been practicing for weeks." "I'm honored," Willow assured him. "And I know she'll do beautifully." The interaction set the tone for the day. Throughout the morning, Willow found herself greeted warmly by parents and children alike, many expressing appreciation for her teaching or commenting on recent school activities. Even those who had initially been most opposed to her standing during prayer now engaged her in friendly conversation. "People respect commitment," Vaughn observed quietly as they strolled between stalls examining handcrafted items. "You stayed true to your principles without becoming bitter or divisive. That matters in a community this size." "I had good support," Willow replied, squeezing his arm gently. Their progress through the festival was interrupted frequently by well-wishers and business associates wanting to speak with Vaughn. Willow observed with interest how he handled each interaction, attentive but efficient with those seeking favors, warmly engaged with longtime friends, especially patient with the elderly or very young. His natural leadership was evident not in any demand for deference, but in the respect freely given by those who knew him well. By midday, the festival was in full swing. Competitions ranged from serious tests of agricultural prowess to light-hearted contests designed primarily for entertainment. Vaughn was persuaded to join the axe-throwing competition, where he acquitted himself respectably, but was bested by Jim Harker, whose years of forestry experience before becoming ranch foreman gave him an unbeatable advantage. "You threw that competition," Willow teased as they walked away from the cheering crowd. Vaughn's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation, Miss O'Sullivan." "I've seen you split logs at the ranch," she persisted. "Your aim is better than what you showed today." A smile tugged at his mouth. Jim's eldest son just turned 16. Winning that competition means a great deal to him as a father. The simple statement, delivered without any expectation of praise for his thoughtfulness, epitomized what Willow had come to love about Vaughn: his quiet consideration for others, never performed for show or recognition. As afternoon progressed toward evening, musicians began setting up on the raised platform at the center of the square. Oil lamps and torches were positioned to illuminate the dance area, promising festivities that would continue well into the night. "Would you care to rest before the dancing begins?" Vaughn asked, noting Willow's slight fatigue after hours of walking and socializing. "That would be lovely," she admitted. "Perhaps some tea at the refreshment tent." They found a relatively quiet corner in the large canvas tent, where the women's auxiliary had established a refreshment station. Over tea and fresh baked cookies, they watched the festival activity through the open tent flaps, commenting on particular displays or performances that had caught their attention. "Reverend Thompson seems to be enjoying himself," Willow observed, spotting the minister laughing with a group of church elders near the pie-judging table. "He's mellowed considerably these past months," Vaughn noted. "I think Judge Parker's scriptural debate with him last month may have broadened his perspective somewhat. Or perhaps he simply accepted that diversity of thought need not threaten community cohesion," Willow suggested. "A valuable lesson for any society," Vaughn agreed, his expression growing more serious. "Willow, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." The formal tone caught her attention. "What is it?" Before he could continue, they were interrupted by Martha Jenkins, who appeared with a platter of fresh pastries. "You simply must try these, Miss O'Sullivan. My new recipe took second prize in the baking competition." What followed was a steady stream of interruptions as various townspeople stopped to chat, share festival news, or simply greet them. By the time they finished their tea, the musicians had begun tuning their instruments, and lanterns glowed warmly against the deepening twilight. "Shall we?" Vaughn asked, offering his hand as the first strains of a waltz filled the air. Dancing with Vaughn had become one of Willow's greatest pleasures during their courtship. Despite his imposing height and the physical power evident in his build, he moved with a natural grace that made her feel both secure and weightless in his arms. As they circled the wooden dance floor, other couples gradually joined them, the space filling with movement and laughter. "You never finished telling me what you wanted to discuss," Willow reminded him during a brief pause between dances. "It can wait for a more private moment," Vaughn replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. "Tonight is for celebration." The festival continued for 3 joyous days, with each morning bringing new activities and competitions culminating in evening dances and performances. Sarah Miller delivered her recitation flawlessly, beaming with pride as Willow led the audience in enthusiastic applause. Judge Parker arrived for the final day's events, bringing news from the territorial capital and engaging Willow in spirited conversation about educational developments in the East. On the festival's final evening, as moonlight silvered the landscape and the last dance concluded, Vaughn guided Willow away from the dispersing crowd toward a quieter area near the old oak tree where they had first spoken months before. "I've been trying to find the right moment all weekend," he said, a hint of uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "For what?" Willow asked, though her quickening pulse suggested she already knew. Vaughn took both her hands in his expression solemn in the moonlight. "When I was a boy, my mother told me that the greatest blessing in life was finding someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. I didn't understand what she meant until I met you." He took a deep breath before continuing. "You've shown me what it means to stand tall in your convictions without diminishing others. You've brought learning and hope to children who had little of either. And you've brought joy and purpose back into my life when I thought those days were behind me." Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. "Willow O'Sullivan, I love you with everything I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had suspected this moment was coming, the reality of it, Vaughn kneeling before her in the moonlight, his heart laid bare in his eyes, left Willow momentarily speechless. Emotion welled in her chest, a year's journey from solitary defiance to profound connection crystallizing in this perfect moment. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice gaining strength as she repeated, "Yes, Vaughn Galloway, I will marry you. With all my heart, yes." His smile transformed his face as he rose and gathered her into his arms, lifting her briefly off her feet in an exuberant embrace that made her laugh with delight. When he set her down, his hands cradled her face with infinite tenderness. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. It was my mother's. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right person to wear it. Inside lay a ring of unusual design, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds set in intricate gold filigree. It's beautiful, Willow breathed as Vaughn slid it onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed symbolic of their relationship. My father commissioned it in Sweden before they immigrated, Vaughn explained. The sapphire reminded him of her eyes, he said. I always thought it appropriate that she wore a piece of the sky on her hand, she who taught me to look upward in prayer rather than down. The connection to their own story wasn't lost on Willow, who felt tears gathering in her eyes. I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you, Vaughn assured her, his voice rich with certainty. For your intelligence, your compassion, and especially for your courage in standing tall when it would have been easier to bow. Their kiss beneath the ancient oak tree, witnessed only by the harvest moon and stars overhead, sealed a promise, born of shared values and mutual respect. As they walked back toward town hand in hand, Willow felt a profound sense of rightness, as though all the paths of her life had been leading to this place, this moment, this man who had defended her right to stand tall before God and now asked her to stand beside him for life. News of their engagement spread quickly through Chisholm Ranch, met with general approval and excitement. Mrs. Abernathy took particular pride in having seen it coming from the very beginning, while Martha Jenkins immediately began organizing a quilting circle to create a wedding gift. Even Reverend Thompson offered congratulations, though he couldn't resist adding a gentle suggestion that perhaps married life might moderate some of Miss O'Sullivan's more independent tendencies, a comment that made Vaughn smile diplomatically while squeezing Willow's hand in silent solidarity. Plans for a spring wedding evolved naturally, allowing time for Willow to complete the school year and for necessary preparations. Judge Parker agreed to return for the ceremony, and letters were dispatched to Willow's few remaining relatives in Boston, though she held little hope they would undertake such a lengthy journey for a niece who had scandalized the family by moving west unchaperoned. As autumn deepened toward winter, Willow divided her time between teaching and learning the operations of Galloway Ranch. Vaughn insisted she understand every aspect of the business that would soon be partly hers, from cattle breeding records to water rights negotiations. Though initially intimidated by the scale of the enterprise, Willow found her education and organizational skills well suited to the management side of ranching, while Vaughn's practical experience and deep knowledge of the land complemented her theoretical approach. "We make a good team," he observed one evening as they reviewed breeding plans for the spring calving season. "Your fresh perspective challenges practices I've followed without question for years. And your experience prevents me from suggesting impractical innovations," Willow replied with a smile. "Though I still maintain that implementing a more systematic record-keeping system would save time in the long run." "And I concede the point," Vaughn said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Jim nearly wept with gratitude when you reorganized the tack room last month. Said he'd been looking for that specialized bridle for 2 years. Their easy partnership extended beyond ranch business. As Christmas approached, they worked together with the school board to organize a holiday program combining traditional celebrations with educational elements. Vaughn donated lumber for a proper stage in the town hall, while Willow directed the children in recitations, songs, and a simple play depicting the history of the territory. On Christmas Eve, after a successful community celebration that had filled the town hall to capacity, Vaughn drove Willow to the ranch for a private dinner. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland that sparkled in the moonlight. The main house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. A massive tree dominating the parlor, adorned with candles and ornaments Vaughn's mother had collected over decades. "It's magical," Willow breathed, taking in the warm, festive atmosphere that contrasted so sharply with the austere Christmases of her New England childhood. "Christmas was my mother's favorite celebration," Vaughn explained, helping her remove her heavy coat. She maintained all the Swedish traditions, even when supplies were difficult to obtain, said it connected her to home. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the family's best china and silver. Rosa, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Galloway family since Vaughn's childhood, had prepared a feast that combined traditional American dishes with Swedish specialties Vaughn remembered from his youth. "I have something for you," Vaughn said when they had retired to the parlor, the room bathed in the warm glow of candles and firelight. He retrieved a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "It seemed appropriate for our first Christmas." Willow carefully unwrapped the gift to reveal a framed painting of the schoolhouse, rendered in soft watercolors that captured the golden light of late afternoon falling across the simple building. In the foreground, a female figure stood on the steps, her posture straight and proud as she gazed toward distant mountains. "Vaughn, it's beautiful," she said, deeply touched by the personal nature of the gift. "I didn't know you painted." "I don't," he admitted. "I commissioned it from an artist in Santa Fe based on a sketch I made. I wanted to capture the place where I first truly saw you standing tall when everyone else bowed low." Willow blinked back tears, setting the painting carefully aside before reaching into her own small bag. "My gift seems inadequate in comparison, but I hope you'll treasure it nonetheless." The package she handed him was small and simply wrapped. Vaughn opened it carefully to reveal a leather-bound volume, its cover tooled with intricate designs surrounding the title, selected poems and verses. "Open it," Willow encouraged softly. Inside, written in her neat, precise handwriting, were dozens of poems and passages she had collected throughout her life, verses that had sustained her through difficult times, inspired her in moments of doubt, or simply captured the beauty of existence in ways that resonated with her spirit. "I've been compiling this since I was 16, she explained as he turned the pages slowly. "Each entry marks a significant moment or realization. The last few pages are new, added since coming west, since meeting you." Vaughn turned to these recent additions, reading with obvious emotion the carefully selected verses that chronicled their developing relationship, from Emily Dickinson's "Hope is the Thing with Feathers," marked with the date of their first meeting, to Elizabeth Barrett Browning's "How Do I Love Thee?" "Let me count the ways," inscribed on the day he had proposed. "This is the most precious gift I've ever received," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "A glimpse into your heart's journey." "There's room for many more pages," Willow said softly, "for all the years ahead." Their kiss beneath the Christmas tree, gentle at first then deepening with shared passion, seemed to seal the promise of those future pages, a life written together, standing tall through whatever joys and challenges might come. Winter yielded gradually to spring, the harsh beauty of snow-covered mountains giving way to vibrant new growth across the valley. Wedding preparations accelerated as the chosen date in May approached. The women of Chisholm Ranch embraced the event with enthusiasm, organizing sewing circles for Willow's trousseau and planning elaborate decorations for both church and the subsequent celebration at Galloway Ranch. To Willow's surprise, a letter arrived from her maternal aunt in Boston, announcing that she and her husband would indeed make the journey west for the wedding. "Though we question your decision to leave civilization," Aunt Margaret wrote, Your letters describing your new life and the man you've chosen have convinced us that perhaps the territories hold more refinement than we presumed. Translation: They're dying of curiosity, Willow told Vaughn with a laugh as she read him the letter. Aunt Margaret can't bear the thought of not being able to provide first-hand reports to Boston society about my scandalous frontier marriage. Should I have the Cowboys practice their table manners? Vaughn asked, eyes twinkling. Perhaps Jim could refrain from spitting tobacco during the reception. Don't you dare encourage any such performances, Willow warned, though she couldn't suppress her own amusement at the thought of her proper Boston relatives confronted with exaggerated frontier behavior. As April brought warmer days and nights fragrant with blooming wildflowers, Vaughn was frequently away from the ranch, supervising spring calving and the annual cattle drive to summer pastures. During one such absence, Willow took advantage of the opportunity to meet privately with Reverend Thompson, hoping to resolve any lingering tensions before the wedding. "I appreciate you making time to see me, Reverend," she said, accepting the chair he offered in his small study adjoining the church. "I assume this concerns the wedding ceremony," he replied, his manner cordial if not warm. "Partly," Willow acknowledged. "But more fundamentally, it concerns our relationship moving forward. As Vaughn's wife, I'll have a more permanent role in this community. I would prefer that role not be defined by past disagreements." The Reverend studied her thoughtfully. "You've proven yourself more adaptable than I initially expected, Miss O'Sullivan. Your work with the children is commendable, and you've shown respect for local traditions even while maintaining your personal convictions." "Thank you," Willow said, slightly surprised by the admission. "I've tried to honor the community while remaining true to myself." "A difficult balance," Reverend Thompson acknowledged, "one I perhaps failed to appreciate in our earlier interactions." He hesitated, then continued with evident effort. "I may have been overzealous in my initial response to your prayer posture." Coming from Reverend Thompson, this qualified acknowledgement represented a significant concession. Willow inclined her head respectfully. "We all have our deeply held beliefs, Reverend. I never meant my actions as a challenge to your authority, only as an expression of my personal relationship with God." "As to the wedding ceremony," he continued, returning to more comfortable ground, "I assume you and Mr. Galloway have discussed your preferences." "We have," Willow confirmed. "We would like a traditional service in most respects, with one small modification to the standard vows." A wariness entered the Reverend's expression. "What modification?" "Rather than promising to obey, I would prefer to pledge to honor and cherish. Vaughn is in complete agreement." Reverend Thompson's lips tightened briefly, but then, to Willow's surprise, he nodded. "Given Mr. Galloway's consent, I find that acceptable. The essence of the commitment remains intact." As their meeting concluded, the Reverend offered his hand. "I wish you and Vaughn every happiness, Miss O'Sullivan. He is a good man who has carried many burdens alone. I believe you will be a worthy partner for him." "Thank you, Reverend." "That means a great deal to me," Willow replied, recognizing the olive branch for what it was: not full approval of her beliefs, but acceptance of her place in the community and in Vaughn's life. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring blossoms through the open windows of Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. Willow's aunt and uncle had arrived 2 days earlier, their initial shock at the primitive conditions gradually giving way to reluctant admiration for the natural beauty of the landscape and the unexpected refinement of Galloway Ranch. "He's quite civilized for a cattleman," Aunt Margaret had conceded after dinner at the ranch. "And clearly besotted with you, my dear. I suppose there are worse fates than being the mistress of such an estate, even if one must endure the inconvenience of distance from proper society. Now, as Martha Jenkins and Mrs. Abernathy helped Willow dress for the ceremony, Aunt Margaret supervised with critical attention to detail, insisting that certain Boston standards of bridal preparation be maintained despite the frontier setting. The dress they arranged around Willow was a compromise between Eastern elegance and Western practicality, ivory silk ordered from Santa Fe. Its design simpler than Boston fashion dictated, but adorned with hand-sewn lace contributed by various women of the community, each piece representing a family's treasured heirloom, shared to create something new and beautiful for the bride. "You look absolutely radiant," Martha declared, stepping back to admire the completed ensemble. Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, like something from a painting. Even Aunt Margaret nodded approval. "You carry yourself well, Willow. Your mother would be proud." The simple words from her usually reserved aunt brought unexpected tears to Willow's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's, the one family treasure she had brought west. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Judge Parker, who had agreed to escort Willow to the church in the absence of any male relatives. The distinguished jurist bowed formally as Willow emerged from her room. "Miss O'Sullivan, you are a vision that would inspire poetry from the most prosaic of men," he declared. "Galloway is a fortunate man indeed." The short journey to the church passed in a blur of anticipation. Willow was vaguely aware of townspeople lining the street, offering smiles and good wishes as the carriage rolled past. But her thoughts were focused on the moment ahead, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single act of quiet defiance nearly a year before. The church had been transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, every pew filled with well-wishers from Chisholm Ranch and surrounding settlements. As Willow paused at the entrance, the assembled guests rose in respect, and all eyes turned to watch her progress down the aisle. But Willow saw only Vaughn, waiting for her beside Reverend Thompson at the altar. His expression, as she approached, contained everything she had come to treasure about him: strength tempered by gentleness, confidence without arrogance, and a depth of feeling that needed no elaborate declaration to be understood. Judge Parker placed her hand in Vaughn's with formal dignity, then stepped aside as the ceremony began. Reverend Thompson's rich voice filled the small church, guiding them through the ancient promises with unexpected warmth. When the time came for their vows, Willow's voice remained steady as she pledged to love, honor, and cherish, rather than obey a subtle distinction that represented the equality of partnership they had chosen. As Vaughn repeated his own vows, his voice resonated with quiet certainty that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers present. The moment he was instructed to kiss his bride, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the congregation, led by Sarah Miller's enthusiastic exclamation, "She's Mrs. Galloway now." The celebration that followed at the ranch was the most joyous gathering in Chisholm Ranch's history. Tables groaned with food prepared by every household in the community. Musicians played from midday into the evening, and children raced across the expansive grounds while adults danced and conversed on the decorated porch. As twilight deepened into evening, Willow found a moment alone with her new husband on the same terrace where he had first shown her the magnificent view of the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Galloway?" Vaughn asked, his arm encircling her waist as they watched the first stars appear over the mountains. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Willow replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "Though I must admit, hearing that name still sounds strange." "You'll have time to grow accustomed to it," he assured her with a smile. Many years, God willing. I was thinking, Willow said, turning in his embrace to face him, about that first Sunday in church. If I had bowed my head like everyone else, I would have noticed you anyway, Vaughn finished for her. But I might not have recognized what made you special, your courage to stand by your convictions, even when standing alone. I wasn't alone for long, she reminded him, thinking of how he had defended her, then stood beside her when it mattered most. No, Vaughn agreed, drawing her closer. And you never will be again. Their kiss beneath the vast canopy of stars sealed a promise born of mutual respect, and deepened through shared challenges, a love that had begun with one woman's refusal to bow her head, and one man's wisdom to recognize that God indeed hears us standing tall. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning, Willow Galloway stood on the porch of the main house, watching her husband lead their 3-year-old son James on a gentle pony across the ranch yard. The boy's delighted laughter carried clearly on the morning air, bringing a smile to her face as she cradled their infant daughter Alina against her shoulder. Much had changed in the years since their wedding. The railroad had indeed reached Chisholm Ranch, bringing growth and prosperity to the settlement that was now officially incorporated as a town. The new schoolhouse, built on land donated by Vaughn as promised, housed 3 teachers and over 60 students, a testament to the community's expansion and commitment to education. Willow had continued teaching until James's birth, then shifted to an administrative role overseeing curriculum development for the school while balancing her responsibilities as mother and ranch mistress. The transition had been challenging at times, but Vaughn's unwavering support and partnership made it possible for her to maintain both her family commitments and her passion for education. "Higher, Papa, higher." James called as Vaughn lifted him from the pony's back and swung him through the air in a game that never failed to produce excited squeals. "Be careful with him, Vaughn," Willow called, though she knew her caution was unnecessary. For all his strength, Vaughn handled their children with extraordinary gentleness, his love for them evident in every interaction. As they approached the porch, Willow observed the striking resemblance between father and son, the same dark hair and clear blue eyes, though James had inherited her more delicate features. Alina, in contrast, showed signs of developing Willow's auburn coloring but with her father's strong jawline and determined expression. "Look what we found by the creek, Mama," James announced proudly as they climbed the steps. He opened his small hand to reveal a perfectly shaped arrowhead. "Papa says the Apache people made it long ago." "It's beautiful," Willow agreed, examining the stone artifact. "We should add it to your collection." "First lessons in territorial history," Vaughn explained, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "He's quite the curious scholar." "Like his mother," Willow said with a smile. "And stubborn like his father," Vaughn countered, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Alina's head before brushing his lips across Willow's cheek. "How is our little lady this morning?" "Finally sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch," Willow reported. "Rosa says she's the most determined baby she's ever encountered." "Standing tall already," Vaughn observed with a grin, taking the infant from Willow's arms with practiced ease. Alina immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength, drawing another smile from her father. Later that afternoon, as the children napped under Rosa's watchful eye, Willow and Vaughn rode together to the highest point on the ranch property, a ridgeline overlooking the entire valley, where spring wildflowers created a carpet of vivid colors across the landscape. It had become their tradition to visit this spot on their wedding anniversary, taking time to reflect on the year past and the path ahead. "I received a letter from the territorial governor yesterday," Vaughn mentioned as they dismounted and spread a blanket on their favorite outcropping of sun-warmed rock. He's forming a commission to establish educational standards across the territory. Asked if you would consider serving as a representative for this region, Willow's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But there are more experienced educators in Santa Fe, surely. None who have successfully established a multi-teacher school in a remote community or developed curriculum specifically adapted to frontier needs, Vaughn pointed out. Your approach has drawn attention beyond Chisholm Ranch. It would mean traveling occasionally, Willow said thoughtfully, considering the practical implications. With 2 small children. We would manage, Vaughn assured her, reaching for her hand. James and Alina have a father who is perfectly capable of overseeing their care when necessary, not to mention Rosa and half the town ready to assist. Your work is important, Willow. Not just to you, but to children throughout the territory who deserve the same quality of education you've helped create here. Warmth spread through Willow's chest at his words, at the continued evidence that their partnership remained one of mutual support and respect. I'll consider it carefully, she promised. Thank you for believing in me. Always, Vaughn replied simply. They sat in companionable silence, watching the lengthening shadows stretch across the valley as afternoon progressed toward evening. The ranch buildings below seemed to glow in the golden light, smoke rising from chimneys in the serene tableau of home. Did you ever imagine this? Willow asked after a time. That first day in church when you defended a stubborn schoolteacher you barely knew. Vaughn considered the question, his expression thoughtful. Not specifically, no, but I knew something significant had happened, something that mattered in a way I couldn't yet define. He squeezed her hand gently. What about you? Did you imagine this future when you refused to bow your head in prayer? Hardly, Willow laughed softly. I was simply trying to remain true to myself in a new place where I felt very alone. I certainly never anticipated finding the love of my life as a result. God works in mysterious ways, Vaughn said with a smile, echoing Reverend Thompson's favorite phrase but without the minister's solemnity. Speaking of which, did I mention that the Reverend has asked James to play the role of little Samuel in the church pageant next month? Our James? Willow asked in surprise. The boy who announced to his Sunday school class that God probably doesn't mind if we talk during prayer because he made our mouths for a reason. The very same, Vaughn confirmed, eyes twinkling with amusement. Apparently, the Reverend finds his spiritual curiosity refreshing. His exact words. Willow shook her head in wonder. The world does change, doesn't it? 5 years ago, he was scandalized by my standing during prayer. Now he's casting our free-thinking son in the church pageant. People grow when given space and time, Vaughn observed. The Reverend included, though I suspect James's charm played some role in his evolution. He is impossible to resist, Willow agreed fondly, much like his father. As the sun began its final descent toward the western mountains, they gathered their things and mounted their horses for the ride home. Their children would be waking from their naps. The evening meal would need preparation, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys in the continuing story of their life together. Reining in at the crest of the hill for one last look across the valley, Willow felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had led her here from solitary defiance to beloved wife, mother, and respected community member. The journey had begun with a simple act of standing tall when others bowed low, and a cowboy's quiet recognition that God hears us regardless of posture. Ready? Vaughn asked, waiting for her beside the trail that would take them home. Willow nodded, smiling at the man who had defended her right to stand tall and then asked her to stand beside him for life. "Ready," she confirmed, urging her horse forward to join him, equal partners heading toward the future. They continued to build together, one day at a time.